Marc Márquez has delivered many shocks in his career, impossible saves, bone-snapping crashes, heroic comebacks, but nothing prepared MotoGP fans for this. In a season defined by shattered expectations and a Ducati project wobbling under the weight of its own brilliance, Marquez broke the silence with a confession no one saw coming. And it wasn't about himself. It was about Pecco Bagnaia. The same Pecco many believed would be his greatest rival, the rider whose season collapsed under front-end instability, erratic load transfers, and a creeping loss of trust that only a champion recognizes. And suddenly Marquez, the predator who once weaponized pressure, spoke with a raw, unsettling sincerity that froze the paddock. Not analysis. Not rivalry. Something deeper. Something human. Why would the fiercest competitor of his generation publicly bear empathy for the man he was meant to dethrone? What did he see in Bagnaia's collapse that reminded him of his own darkest battles, the ones hidden beneath screws, scars, and silent hospital corridors? And more importantly, what does this confession reveal about the future of Ducati, the 2026 title fight, and a Marquez who seems to be rewriting the very psychology of MotoGP? Fans weren't ready. The paddock wasn't ready. But Marquez said it anyway, and nothing feels the same now. Marc Márquez felt the world tighten around him as the Indonesian asphalt swallowed his front wheel, and in that instant the crash that seemed ordinary to spectators became a private catastrophe he understood too well. He lay there hearing his own pulse louder than the crowd, thinking, "I know this pain, and I fear its echo," while marshals rushed toward him. The paddock assumed it was another violent episode in his storied resilience, but inside he sensed a deeper fracture blooming like a silent storm beneath the skin, a sensation that spread slowly like ink through water and carried a foreboding weight he could not ignore even amid the noise. When he whispered, something was wrong. It wasn't drama but diagnosis from a rider who knows his body as intimately as telemetry knows vibration. The impact had torn ligaments and cracked the coracoid, a small bone that once served as a forgotten anchor for shoulder stability, a vulnerability that altered how force traveled through his shoulder during direction changes. That detail, rarely mentioned, meant the injury struck at the exact hinge that controlled his delicate braking modulation and influenced the micro-corrections he made under heavy deceleration. As dust settled, the smell of hot rubber mixed with disbelief, and the Desmosedici sat abandoned like a musical instrument dropped mid-symphony. Trackside, his right arm throbbed in a rhythm out of tune with his will, echoing the uneven cadence of a machine forced beyond its limits. Time slowed in a cinematic hush, framing his stillness against the blur of returning riders who seemed to pass through a different universe. He felt the weight of 4 past surgeries pressing through the fresh wound like ghosts demanding attention and whispering old warnings. Reporters speculated instantly, but only he tasted the metallic anxiety rising in his throat as he replayed the fall in microscopic detail. The crash replayed on big screens with mechanical coldness that contrasted the intimate chaos within him and sharpened the ache of vulnerability. His engineers later noted an unusual spike in handlebar load milliseconds before impact, a data footprint that hinted at a sudden front-end collapse linked to a tiny variation in fork pressure. Marquez, listening to the debrief with a distant stare, felt the words slide through him without landing as if his mind hovered somewhere between pain and denial. The moment had punctured more than bone. It had ruptured momentum, confidence, and the fragile sense of renewal he carried into 2025, leaving him suspended in doubt. He imagined his season as a tightrope suddenly frayed by invisible hands, shaking under the weight of expectations he never voiced but always carried. Around him, Ducati personnel moved with professional cadence, yet their glances carried unspoken dread that clung to the humid air and thickened the atmosphere around the garage. The medical team lifted him with careful precision, but his thoughts drifted like leaves pulled by a current toward memories he wished had stayed buried. He wondered whether fate was reminding him of debts unpaid as he felt the tremor of uncertainty coil inside his chest and blur the edges of his focus. He fought the urge to clench his fist, knowing pain would answer with cruel honesty, while above the circuit the sky dimmed as if mirroring his uncertainty and sealing the moment in a frame that quietly redrew the entire championship storyline with a single merciless stroke. For the first time since joining Ducati, Marc Márquez faced the unsettling truth that he would miss the Valencia postseason test, a session considered the ignition spark of every future Desmosedici evolution. He walked into the briefing room feeling the awkward silence that follows a decision no one wants to hear, thinking, "I hate stepping aside when the work is just beginning," as engineers avoided meeting his gaze. The team's expectation had always been to shape the GP26 around his precision, yet now that responsibility tilted abruptly onto others like a table losing its balance on a missing leg. when he admitted, "Not the best way to celebrate the championship, but I must respect my body." The words felt heavier than the trophy he had recently lifted. The Valencia test was more than tradition. It was the laboratory where engine character, aero load distribution, and torque delivery curves began their long winter metamorphosis. A little-known detail is that Ducati planned to validate a new front ride height valve calibrated specifically around Marquez's aggressive corner entry signature. Without him, that mapping becomes guesswork wrapped in theory. The engineers tried to mask their concern, but their nervous pencil tapping sounded like rain falling on thin metal. Marquez sensed their unease and felt as though he were watching his own shadow detach from the walls of the garage. He imagined the bike evolving without his fingerprints, a violin learning new notes without its virtuoso. Time seemed to stretch like cooling asphalt as he listened to discussions he should have been leading. The winter ahead suddenly looked longer, colder, and less predictable, despite the optimism circulating through the factory's corridors. He knew how delicate early development was, and how a single misinterpreted data point could mislead months of progress. His inner monologue echoed louder than the engineers' voices as he wondered whether absence could wound a project more subtly than any mechanical failure. He tried to reassure them with quiet confidence, but even his smile felt stitched together. The thought that Pecco and Alex would carry the technical burden tugged at him like a thread threatening to unravel his calm. Every rider has a style that distorts data differently, and he feared Ducati might read a blurred signal as a clear message. The garage lights hummed, casting long reflections on the polished floor that made the moment feel strangely theatrical. Outside, the air smelled of fuel and wet paint, a reminder that work continued with or without him. Marquez took a slow breath as if trying to anchor himself to the rhythm of the paddock. Engineers exchanged theories, models, and contingency plans, but his absence hovered like a missing variable in an equation no one could completely solve. He stood still, listening to the faint buzz of laptops and sensors, feeling both present and irrelevant. The uncertainty wrapped itself around the garage like a slow tide. He watched mechanics roll the prototype toward a pit lane, reminded that progress never waits. In his mind, he whispered, "I hope they understand," thought lost in tool noise. As he stepped away, he felt the balance between ambition and limitation tremble. Marc Márquez appeared transformed as the months of recovery carved a quieter strength into him, revealing a version of the champion that contrasted sharply with the relentless warrior the paddock once feared. He moved through the Ducati hospitality with slow deliberation, thinking, maybe stillness can also be a form of courage, a thought that would have been unthinkable for him a few years ago. This new demeanor unfolded in gestures rather than speed, in pauses rather than attacks, and engineers observed it with the same curiosity they applied to telemetry. When he said, "I'm more patient than normal. I need to prepare well this winter," the sentence struck fans like a cold breeze entering a familiar room through an unlocked window. Years of surgeries had reshaped not only his arm but his understanding of limits, teaching him that the body can be a stubborn metronome that refuses to match ambition's tempo. A little-known detail is that during his previous recovery, he trained with microstability sensors attached to his shoulder blades to analyze muscular compensation patterns. Now he embraced such science with the humility of someone who had learned that resilience isn't only measured in crashes survived but also in the quiet discipline of waiting. His calm felt foreign to those who remember the firebrand who once rode as if every lap were a dare written in rubber. Yet this calmer version held a different kind of gravity, like a lighthouse that guides instead of chases. He spoke less, observed more, letting silence gather around him like mist curling at sunrise. Technicians noticed that his questions had changed too, shifting from aggression-driven queries to reflective ones about longevity, efficiency, and mechanical empathy. His transformation mirrored a river smoothing its own stones, subtle but unstoppable. Even the way he handled tools during rehab sessions seemed more deliberate, as though every movement was a negotiation with his past. He often caught himself breathing slower, grounding his thoughts in rhythms that once felt incompatible with his identity. The paddock, always hungry for spectacle, struggled to reconcile this man with the myth they had built around him. He wondered if they saw weakness where he felt evolution blossoming quietly, like roots spreading beneath winter soil. Ducati staff exchanged glances filled with both concern and respect, sensing a narrative shift they could not yet define. This serenity, rare in racing's feverish world, radiated through him like steady light on a restless sea. Fans whispered that he looked older, wiser, touched by storms few could imagine, yet they didn't know the true depth of his reconstruction. His patience had become both shield and compass, pointing him toward a season where speed would no longer be his only weapon. And in this unexpected transformation, a new tension rose, tightening the air around his comeback arc with silent promise. In that expanded calm, he sensed a fragile yet growing strength weaving itself through the uncertainty of his recovery, a strength born not from defiance, but from understanding the delicate architecture of his own limits. It felt like watching sunlight return to a valley after a storm, reshaping his ambitions with a clarity that made every future lap feel like a renewed vow to himself. Ducati's development machine felt strangely incomplete as the GP26 prototype rolled into the silent Valencia garage, awaiting the feedback of the one rider who could read its secrets like a hidden language woven into metal. Engineers gathered around the chassis with a tense reverence, thinking, without his hands, this bike has no interpreter, a truth none of them dared to speak aloud. The prototype needed clarity in front-end balance, subtle guidance in aero load mapping, and steady voice to judge engine braking consistency across long stints. Marquez had always provided that with surgical confidence, shaping Ducati's evolution with instinct honed through pain and brilliance. When he stepped back, saying only, "You'll have to trust your process without me," the air inside the garage felt thinner, as though a window had been closed on their winter ambitions. The loss of his sharpest tool left Ducati staring at a development path full of small shadows. A little-known technical concern loomed around a new adaptive swing arm sensor that required calibration based on riding stress patterns only Marc typically generated. Now that responsibility fell onto two riders whose styles diverged like separate musical scores drifting from opposite ends of a corridor. Pecco's meticulous corner entry precision demanded a front end that behaved like a tightrope stretched across still air, steady and predictable. Alex approached the bike like a sudden gust, applying late-braking chaos that transformed stability into something fluid and unpredictable. Expecting both to shape a single machine felt like tuning a violin using the instincts of a drummer and a pianist. Engineers scribbled notes with frantic care, hoping contrasting data could be stitched into coherence. The tension grew as graphs piled up with conflicting peaks. Ducati staff exchanged glances carrying a mixture of admiration and dread for the complexity ahead. The GP26 felt like a creature unsure of its own posture, waiting to be taught how to stand. Each test lap without Marc's input echoed like a question left hanging in the rafters, his absence becoming both shadow and spotlight. The bike's early behavior produced whispers of uncertainty, subtle vibrations hinting at a machine searching for identity. Around the garage, even the hum of generators carried a restless undertone. Engineers bent over laptops with faces drawn tight, calculating what data could not fully reveal. In that moment, as the garage lights flickered softly against the aluminum fairings, Marquez's absence became a looming horizon that stretched across every decision and fragile hope, reminding Ducati that a machine without its interpreter is like a story missing its narrator, suspended in uncertainty. The engineers moved through the garage with quiet urgency, hoping conflicting data could still shape a path. They expanded simulations, adjusted parameters, and reworked feedback cycles, yet doubt clung to each chart. Pecco and Alex offered dedication, but their contrasting signatures stretched the map thin. Still, Ducati pushed onward, believing clarity might rise from confusion if they listened to the machine's trembling voice. And in that silence, the winter began now. Marc Márquez understood too late that the injury haunting him was far more complicated than the paddock first believed, revealing itself with the quiet cruelty of a truth that arrives only when denial collapses. He recalled waking one Sunday to a sharp dislocation in his collarbone, thinking, "This cannot be happening again," as the pain folded him inward with a familiarity he wished he had forgotten. Doctors discovered a bent screw embedded from an older surgery, an unwelcome relic that had twisted the healing process into a hidden trap. The moment they explained the situation, Marquez listened with a stillness that felt heavier than fear. He admitted softly, "Whether I'm competitive in 2026 will depend on my physique, not missing Valencia," a sentence that carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. This revelation struck Ducati with the subtle force of a tremor, sending engineers into silent calculations about lost time and shifting priorities. A little-known technical concern added to the worry. The screw's warped angle had interfered with a crucial ligament chain responsible for stabilizing shoulder rotation under braking loads. Without proper ligament tension, even the most carefully tuned front end would transmit erratic sensations through the handlebars. The injury's complexity reframed Marquez's recovery not as a sprint but as a steady climb requiring humility and patience. He approached each rehabilitation session with reflective calm, like someone relearning trust in the architecture of their own body. The medical room's sterile glow became a quiet theater for his introspection, He often studied his reflection in darkened monitors as though searching for reassurance. Ducati staff visited with words of belief, though their guarded eyes revealed the pressure of a season already bending around uncertainty. Marquez sensed their silent concerns but met them with a gentle confidence that surprised even him. He moved deliberately, accepting that his body now demanded negotiations rather than demands. Each subtle gain in mobility felt like a promise he whispered back into his healing shoulder. The rehabilitation team adjusted protocols daily, watching micro-responses in tendon elasticity and muscle activation. Through these long hours, Marquez confronted how deeply the injury had threaded itself into his confidence. He imagined future laps as careful lines woven with intention rather than sheer defiance, as though painting on fragile glass instead of carving through asphalt. Pain returned in unpredictable tides, reminding him healing never obeys the will of champions. Engineers in Bologna reviewed simulations with cautious faith, crafting scenarios that depended on a calmer, wiser Marquez. The champion learned to value silence as a companion rather than an enemy, allowing vulnerability to soften his competitive edge. Determination rose from that softened place in a new shape, steady, grounded, enduring. And as the weeks unfolded, Marquez understood one essential truth. Sometimes the body breaks not to weaken a rider, but to teach him how to rise differently. He felt each passing day stretch into an intimate dialogue between fragility and resilience, a quiet proving ground where every breath, every cautious stretch, every flicker of returning strength became part of a slow rebirth shaped by the courage to trust his own recovery. In those moments, he felt time hold him. Marc Márquez surprised the entire paddock when he spoke with a tenderness that felt almost foreign to the fierce competitor he had been for most of his career, revealing an empathy that left fans breathless. He confessed that Bagnaia's turbulent season weighed heavily on him, thinking, "I know the loneliness of doubt too well," a reflection that exposed a rare vulnerability. His statement, "It pains me to see him like this," echoed through the press room with the weight of unspoken history between two riders destined to duel at the highest level. For years, Marquez had thrived on psychological warfare, dissecting rivals with precision, yet now his voice carried a softness shaped by experience. Ducati insiders admitted they had never seen him speak this gently about an opponent, especially one expected to be his fiercest adversary. A little-known technical note made his empathy even more poignant. Marquez understood that Bagnaia's struggles stemmed partly from subtle inconsistencies in the GP25's front load transfer, an issue magnified by Pecco's corner entry dependence. The two riders felt the bike differently, like musicians interpreting the same melody with contrasting rhythms. Marquez explained further, saying, "He hasn't forgotten how to ride. The best thing for him is winter." A reset, a phrase that sounded less like advice and more like a quiet reassurance. His words carried the warmth of someone who had once been swallowed by uncertainty and fought his way back with patience rather than pride. Fans who expected rivalry instead witnessed a portrait of solidarity drawn in delicate strokes. The moment felt suspended, as though the world paused to acknowledge a shift within a man known for relentless forward motion. Engineers listening nearby sensed that Marquez was speaking not only about Bagnaia, but about the emotional tax of competing at the edge. He recognized in Pecco's struggles a reflection of his own past descent into doubt, the kind that erodes confidence lap by lap. Each sentence he spoke blended technical insight with a tenderness that unsettled those accustomed to his sharper tone. Around the paddock, whispers rose like rustling leaves, carrying the sentiment that Marquez had changed deeply. This new empathy felt like a door opening into a quieter side of him, shaped by hardship and rebuilt with introspection. Even Ducati managers exchanged glances, aware that these words carried the gravity of lived truth rather than empty comfort. Bagnaia, listening from a distance, reportedly lowered his gaze, touched by the sincerity behind the message. Marquez had turned a moment of analysis into a moment of connection, fusing compassion with experience in a way only a rider who has survived both glory and ruin can. The confession marked a turning point in how the paddock viewed their dynamic, transforming rivalry into something more nuanced and human. Fans replayed the interview repeatedly, searching for the subtle shift in his tone that confirmed everything had changed. His voice carried a quiet strength that suggested empathy can be as powerful as speed, and as he stepped away from the microphones, the paddock felt an unfamiliar stillness settle over them, a recognition that the fiercest battles are sometimes fought within, shaping a rider far more profoundly than any victory lap ever could. And all knew it. Pecco Bagnaia's season unraveled with a slow, painful inevitability that left the Ducati garage holding its breath as if watching a star collapse in real time, and each crash seemed to carve another piece out of his confidence until even team managers admitted they were out of solutions. He rode like a man searching for a rhythm that once felt effortless, thinking, where did the instinct go? A question that echoed louder than the engine beneath him. The non-scores accumulated like shadows across his campaign, deepening the unease that had settled inside the red walls of the factory box. Front-end unpredictability became the ghost he could not outrun, haunting corner entry with inconsistent feedback that denied him the trust he needed to attack. Engineers traced the instability to a subtle harmonic in the chassis flex pattern, a little-known technical quirk magnified under extreme lean angles that punished Bagnaia's smooth style. Each race became a test of emotional endurance rather than speed, and his post-session debrief shrank into quiet nods and long silences that spoke louder than any telemetry sheet. Marquez watched all of it with an empathy sharpened by his own history of losing rhythm, identity, and faith in the very instincts that had once defined him. When he finally said, "It pains me to see him like this," it wasn't pity but a recognition born from scars, both visible and buried. He understood that the fall of a champion is not measured in points lost but in the hollow ache of feeling disconnected from the bike that once felt like an extension of the soul. Around the paddock, the whispers turned from curiosity to concern as Ducati realized their lead rider had drifted into psychological territory no setup change could fully fix. Marquez's perspective carried an unexpected weight, especially to engineers who had once viewed him only as a benchmark rather than a mirror. He reminded them that a struggling rider sends ripples through development, reshaping the project's foundation in ways the public never sees. His message to Ducati was gentle but firm. Pecco's recovery was not optional but essential, as vital as horsepower or aero balance. Bagnaia's sensitivity, once his strength, now required rebuilding with care rather than pressure. Winter, Marquez insisted, could become a sanctuary rather than a deadline. He spoke of resets the way only someone who had rebuilt himself could, blending compassion with technical clarity. Ducati management listened with rare stillness, absorbing the truth in his tone. They saw that Marquez wasn't defending a teammate, he was defending the soul of the project. In that soft yet unwavering conviction, Marquez revealed the depth of his transformation, bridging rivalry and humanity with a single steady breath. And as the paddock replayed his words, one sentiment rose above the noise. Pecco's return was not just possible, it was necessary. Marc Márquez will stand at Valencia in street clothes rather than leathers, a sight that feels almost surreal to fans who have spent a decade watching him carve physics into submission, and the contrast between stillness and speed will echo through the paddock like an unfinished chord. He walks the pit lane slowly, thinking, "This winter is my real race," a truth that reveals a man who has finally learned to treat time as an ally rather than an opponent. The absence of his number from the timing screens will sting, yet it also signals a shift in his priorities as he rebuilds his body for an 8-title assault in 2026. Ducati staff observe him with a mixture of unease and admiration, sensing the discipline behind his restraint. A little-known detail adds depth to the moment. Marquez requested biomechanical mapping this winter to correct microscopic asymmetries left behind by years of compensating for old injuries. The long game has replaced the instinct for immediate dominance, and it shows in the calm precision of his words. He even hinted the next grid may host 4 legitimate title contenders, a prediction that sparked murmurs across the garage. Instead of fear, he greeted the idea with steady acceptance, as though competition now inspires curiosity rather than intimidation. "Being competitive in 2026 depends on my physique. That's my priority," he said, and the sentence carried the calm certainty of someone carving a new path. Around him, the hum of tools and generators formed a rhythmic backdrop to his thoughtful silence. Marquez's presence, even without a bike beneath him, still reshaped the emotional temperature of the paddock. Fans found themselves rethinking what strength looks like when their fiercest warriors stand still instead of charging into turn 1. Crew members noted how he studied the track with a contemplative gaze, not as a battlefield but as a horizon waiting for the right moment to return. Each gesture, each pause, felt weighted with intention rather than absence. The air around him held a quiet promise, as though the season ahead would be built on foundations laid in reflection rather than adrenaline. His demeanor suggested an evolution deeper than technique, touching something elemental in his character. Ducati engineers whispered that his patience seemed almost strategic, a stabilizing counterbalance to the chaos of development. The paddock sensed the quiet glow of a rider who has walked through pain and returned with clarity instead of bitterness. Even rivals admitted privately that this version of Marquez felt more dangerous precisely because he now understood the power of restraint. And in a world addicted to velocity, his calm revealed a truth many forget. Sometimes slowing down is not surrender, but preparation for the most decisive acceleration of all, exposing the most human and astonishingly resilient side of MotoGP's fiercest warrior.